So I was scrolling through YouTube earlier and I came across this video, and usually I wouldn't watch something like this, but I thought about it for a second and I was like, well, what if Marian apparitions aren't true? What if they don't point to Jesus? So let me look at this video and see what he has to say.
Suddenly, something on the roof of St. Mary's got his attention, a figure that looked like a young woman. The mechanic pointed it out to a few people nearby who saw the same thing. Concerned that the young lady was about to commit suicide, they called the police. The crowd gathered around the church to watch, then after just a few minutes, the woman suddenly vanished. Some people began to connect the dots. This is St. Mary's Church. The church is believed to be one of the locations that Jesus' family stayed during their flight to Egypt. We're seeing a shining female figure on the roof. Surely this must be the mother
Seems
of
like
Jesus.
decent logic
From
to
there,
me.
the appearances began to happen more frequently, at times lasting for hours. In some reports, the apparition appeared to be bowing toward the cross atop the church or blessing onlookers on the street below. The Coptic Orthodox Pope appointed a committee of high-ranking priests and bishops to investigate. On May 4th, the church issued an official statement confirming the apparitions as genuine. The apparitions were witnessed even by the Egyptian president. Some were recorded on film by newspaper photographers and Egyptian television. Police investigations found no apparent explanation. No device was found within a radius of 15 miles capable of projecting the image, and many photos were taken of the alleged apparition from independent sources. With no alternative explanation and approval from religious and political leaders, the Egyptian government accepted the apparitions as true. So
The whole
why in the
Egyptian
world am I talking about
government
the
is
Marian
kinda
apparitions
crazy.
of Zaytun? It's because biblical scholars like Dale Allison and Bart Ehrman attempt to parallel these experiences with Jesus' resurrection appearances. Bart Ehrman agrees with Allison. He seemingly points out some inconsistency among the resurrection apologists like William Lane Craig, Gary Habermas, and Mike Licona. Protestant apologists interested in proving that Jesus was raised from the dead rarely show any interest in applying their finely honed historical talents to the exalted Blessed Virgin Mary. While Ehrman doesn't call them out by name, these three prominent resurrection apologists are all committed Baptists. When an emailer asked about the parallel between Marian appearances and Jesus' post-mortem appearances, Dr. William Lane Craig had his colleague Mike Licona respond to the reader's question. Licona wrote, "In my debates with Ehrman when he has raised the topic of Marian apparitions, I responded that I do not doubt that the recipients saw something. What they saw is what I question." Elliot Miller and Kenneth Samples co-authored the book The Cult of the Virgin, Catholic Mariology, and the Apparitions of Mary. In this book, they discuss three major accounts of Marian apparitions: Lourdes, France; Fatima, Portugal; Medjugorje, Croatia. I know Samples personally. He has interviewed several of the seers to whom Mary has appeared to in Medjugorje. Although Samples is a Christian whose Protestant theology does not incline him to believe that Mary has appeared to others, he is convinced that these seers have seen a spirit being. In fact, I had an opportunity to inquire further of Samples on the matter. He told me that several of the seers in Medjugorje continue to have visions of Mary. In fact, he was with one of the seers while he was experiencing such a vision, although no one else in the room saw her. Samples told me he asked the seer if Mary had spoken to him. The seer said she had, recommending a specific book which the seer was to read. When Samples looked up the title of the book, it was occultic. This led him to believe that a demonic spirit is what is appearing to the seers.
So before we get his take on those apparitions, the Medjugorje, I don't even know how to say it. Those apparitions are not officially recognized by the Catholic Church, and so if you find a seer from it, of which I believe that there are many, if you find a seer from it and they're saying that Mary told them to read an occult book, that would probably mean that either the apparition wasn't real or that was a false seer. And so I would say there that if the apparition is leading you to something that is away from Christ, that is fundamentally opposed to him, then it is not a real Marian apparition.
I'm sure that the "it's the devil" hypothesis will probably offend most Catholic Christians, and I'd bet that Ehrman would be content to let them fight it out amongst themselves. Pitting Catholics versus Protestants is a classic move made by skeptics going back to the deist controversy in the 17th and 18th century. Rather than denying the evidence, Licona refers to Samples' theological argument, which seems to be based on some personal anecdotes and doctrinal inferences. Even if you're theologically opposed to the veneration of Mary, this evil spirit hypothesis might be giving the devil more credit than is actually due. While I myself am a settled Protestant, I'm not automatically inclined to say that all Marian apparitions are either delusions, hoaxes, or demonic just because of my prior theological commitments. With enough evidence, my mind could conceivably be changed. But I don't think that the Marian apparitions come anywhere near what we have for the evidence for the resurrection.
So it seems like his main concern here isn't the aspect of this where it is atheist versus Christian and that double standard there. He's really concerned about the double standard between Catholics and Protestants who don't accept these miracles. And the fact that if they did accept these miracles, they would then have to abandon their whole idea of Mariology, and in some cases, their idea of how the saints even function. And so it seems that his whole perspective here and the whole thing that he's trying to remedy is the Protestant side of this and how it may look bad on Protestants. So let's go forward and see what sort of arguments he identifies himself with and what he tries to do with that.
What would convince me of Marian apparitions? Well, let's think about it. Imagine if Mary appeared to a dozen people and ate several meals with them, and they touched her hands and she conversed with them. Now, also suppose that this group was made up of 12 Protestants, living in a country where converting to Catholicism could result in their arrest, torture, or death. That would move me a bit closer to accepting them. But there is a big problem. No one who has seen an apparition of Mary knew Mary personally before she died. Sure, there's a tradition that she appeared to James, the son of Zebedee, in Spain in 40 AD, but the evidence for this tradition is rather thin, and Mary was probably still alive at that time. Those who believe in this appearance claim that she was supernaturally present in 2 places at once. The very first recorded Marian apparition approved by the Catholic Church was in 1555. Obviously, Mary hasn't been known by anybody personally for centuries, so there's always at least the possibility that someone could be hoaxing these people in this proposed scenario.
Okay, so that's kind of interesting because he says the reason why they might not be as solid and why you might not want to accept them is because nobody that would have a Marian apparition would have ever known Mary before. And so they could be mistaken and it might actually not be Mary. Okay, that's a little strange because you think about Paul, for instance. How do we know that Paul didn't just see a demon instead of Jesus? Because he'd never seen Jesus before. Paul wasn't a disciple of Jesus Christ. In fact, he was an enemy of him. And yet, Paul, in a blinding light, he can't see, mind you, at this point. Somebody speaks to him and claims to be Jesus Christ. And Paul follows him and he believes in him. But who is to say that that wasn't a demon that was letting Paul astray? And perhaps that's why we ended up getting the gospel preached to the Gentiles and taking away circumcision in the law. Maybe it wasn't Jesus' plan that we should do that, because he didn't say that we should do that. So why is it that we believe that Paul's revelation was real rather than an evil one which led us all astray? I think the answer to that is because Jesus himself says, if they are not against us, then they are with us. And moreover, Jesus said that you could test any spirit. He literally gave us a model for how to deal with this situation. You test the spirits by seeing their fruits. You look at their fruits. And likewise, he said that a kingdom cannot be divided against itself. So you wouldn't have a demon casting out demons in the name of Satan. That's not how that works. Demons wouldn't do that. And so, according to Jesus, we should look at the fruits of these sorts of apparitions to see whether they actually are from God or if they're not from God, because the fruits would tell. And when we look at Marian apparitions, particularly the one that he's talking about, the one in Egypt, what was the fruit of it? People being converted to Christianity. Hundreds of thousands of people witnessing it and being moved by the Holy Spirit and being moved to convert to Christianity. Likewise, you can see the miracles at Fatima, and then in Mexico, you see people being converted to Christianity. And when Mary appears to them, what does she say? She directs them to Jesus Christ and tells them to worship him and to follow him. So, according to the directions that Jesus gave us, would we not say that such a thing could be proven to be of God because it is directing people towards God? The devils wouldn't, the demons wouldn't do such a thing, because then they would be breaking apart their own kingdom. And you see in these apparitions, the fruit of it is conversion to Christianity. So why is it a question? Why does it matter whether anybody who are experiencing these apparitions had known Mary before? It doesn't. It doesn't matter, because by the fruits of those apparitions, we can test those spirits to know that they are of God. So I just don't see why this argument matters at all. And he says, oh, well, what if you have, maybe if it was like 12 people that saw Mary and then they were persecuted for it, then he would be more convinced. But that's what we see. We've seen people be persecuted because of Marian apparitions. We've seen them be pressed against by the government and by the people because they shouldn't be seeing those things. They shouldn't be following Mary. They don't want them to go back to Mary, and yet they do, because Mary brings them to Christ. So we even see that situation in which he says he would be more convinced. And then his only other argument is that they didn't know Mary before, but Jesus gives us direction as to what to do in this situation. So I just don't see why I just don't see why this really matters. Why this argument that he's saying it holds up. But maybe he'll go into a little bit more that'll strengthen his case.
Ah, yes, hoaxes. People laughed when Robert Greg Cavan came up with his twin brother theory to explain away the resurrection. But Cavan had to come up with a theory to explain why the disciples thought that they saw the risen Jesus, as they knew what Jesus looked like. They had hung out with him for 3 years. But some might say that perhaps what the apostles saw was akin to something like what the people saw in Zaytun. Maybe they experienced something like a bright light a rooftop that they mistook to be Jesus, and enthusiasm took its course from there. The problem with that is that we can't say that if we take the gospel account seriously. The gospel accounts report multi-sensory group appearances extended across 40 days. These appearances involve conversations with Jesus, touching his wounds, and eating fish together. These aren't the kind of things that you can be easily mistaken about. Ehrman and Allison think that these accounts are embellished and unreliable, and that is why they run this parallel. It's not that they don't think the disciples experienced appearances of Jesus of some sort. They do. That's because of what Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 15, that Peter, the 12, Paul, James, and an unnamed 500 brothers all claim to have seen the risen Jesus. But what the appearances were like is not something that Paul goes into detail about. If the best evidence that we have for the resurrection is the creed that Paul quotes to the Corinthians, then we're left with a pretty vague report. Or to use Allison's words, depressingly sparse. Vague appearances that were overinterpreted by the disciples would be consistent with the creed in 1 Corinthians 15. So, if we're going to defend the resurrection, we're going to need to defend the detailed reports contained in the Gospels, or what the disciples reported. But because Lacona only uses facts that 90% plus of scholars agree upon, which include the likes of Allison and Ehrman, he's not actually able to do that. For example, counterapologists and skeptical YouTube apologia asked if there was possible embellishments in the gospel reports, and this is what Lacona had to say.
Do the Gospels, in terms of the appearances of Jesus, do they contain any legendary elements? Well, that's impossible to know, I think.
This is why I'm not a fan at all of the no facts approach. If we're willing to say that the appearances to the Emmaus disciples or Thomas are impossible to know historically, because that's what scholarly consensus allows us to say is a no fact, then there's a massive problem. If we look at the Gospels more closely and fairly, I think we can know with great confidence that they are scrupulous, visually honest, and close to the facts. They were not the kind of authors who were prone to embellish things, nor were they likely to be schizophrenic authors, showing all the signs of truthful testimony, but some of the other times considering themselves free to invent and change facts. So it looks like what they recorded is what was originally claimed by the witnesses of Jesus' resurrection, and this was the apostles' claim in the midst of persecution, so it would be unlikely that they were just inventing things or making things up. See my playlist on the reliability of the Gospels.
Likewise, if you look at these Marian apparitions and all the context of them, all the witnesses, all the things that they said, all the material that they had, you would know that the apparition was of God rather than of the devil. I think that he's attributing all of this context to the Bible, which it does have, but not to these Marian apparitions, in which there were thousands, hundreds of thousands of people that appeared at some of these who saw Mary and were brought to Jesus Christ, who took pictures of it and had corroborating accounts. He brings up this hypothetical of two Protestants that see Marian apparitions and they're valid because they cooperate with each other and they had to lose their careers. But we see similar things in Marian apparitions. Some of these people, when they had these apparitions, they were persecuted because of it. They were told not to ever go back to Mary again, not to ever talk to her. But they kept going back to Mary because she led them to Christ. So I think that he's just missing out on a lot of context here. Now, of course, that there are going to be false Marian apparitions, but there are going to be real ones too. Or rather, we know that there are real ones because we can see the fruits of them and the massive corroborations that happened. He says that the Bible has better testament to it through the written accounts, but again, he's comparing apples to oranges. You have the written accounts in the Gospels, and then you have the photographs in the newspapers for the Marian apparitions, and we still have some of the pieces from these apparitions. Take the tomb of Guadalupe, for instance. These things still exist. He's trying to make it out as if the Gospels just have so much more than these Marian apparitions. Now, I'm not saying that the Gospel doesn't matter as much or these Marian apparitions are just as important, but I think that they're both convincing. Thousands of people were converted in the Bible because of that witness. Thousands of people were converted because of these Marian apparitions, because of that witness. He's trying to downplay it where I just don't think that that's merited.
So, getting back, finally, to Marian apparitions, I don't think that it's at all impossible to have evidence that has strong weight for Marian claims. Let's suppose that two Protestants who had previously publicly criticized Marian doctrines both claimed at the same time having seen a vision of a woman claiming to be Mary, telling them that she was taken bodily into heaven. Neither of these two men had a prior history of mental illness. They both destroyed their own Protestant careers and endangered their lives by claiming this. Furthermore, suppose the woman in question instructed them to call each other and ask each other, "Did you have any strange experience in the last 24 hours?" And they independently did this. That would be very strong evidence of the Marian claims, but it still wouldn't be an exact analogy to Jesus' resurrection appearances on earth. It would probably be more analogous to the conversion of Paul and James. Oddly enough, Dale Allison says that nothing short of Mary appearing to him himself would would convince him. I don't think that our standards need to be that absurdly high. This whole Marian apparition analogy just doesn't work when one takes a more maximal data approach to the Gospels. I might not be able to explain away all Marian apparitions, but they're not the same as the resurrection appearances in the Gospels, and I would hope that Catholics, Protestants, and Orthodox and Coptics would all agree upon that. At best for me, Marian apparitions make me say, maybe the world is a weirder place than I thought, but I don't really know what to make of this. But because there seems to be some vagueness about what these apparitions mean and where they originate from, I don't feel super inclined to believe them. Thank you so much for watching.
You don't want to accept them because the meaning of them is vague? You know what else is vague? You know what else has a vague meaning? Much of the Bible. A lot of the prophets. And then the revelation that John had, for instance. We don't know what a lot of this meant. We don't know what the purpose of it was, what the meaning of it was. But does that mean we shouldn't accept it? No, I don't think so. So I just don't understand how that argument works. And then he says that he doesn't accept them because he doesn't know who it was. But the only way that you can come to these conclusions is either if you ignore the rule that God gave us for how to discern the spirits, or if you ignore the context of these Marian apparitions. And so I think the reason why he's saying, oh, kind of interesting, is because he just doesn't want to look at it. He doesn't want to take it for what it is and deal with the logical consequences of that. Now, I want to say again, nothing against Testify. Nothing against him. I think that he's doing a good job with what he's doing. I think that he's at least trying. And I think that he really does have his heart in the right place with trying to spread the gospel. And I don't think he's being malicious with this at all. And so I wouldn't want anybody to go and attack him. It's just, I had a problem with the argument that he made here. And so I just engaged in the dialogue. I really have no problem. And if you ever see this Testify, I have nothing against you. And I hope that perhaps maybe we could be friends one day. But anyway, at the end of the day, I hope everybody learned something from this. I hope that they learned something new. And that perhaps, if they were hesitant to accept the Marian apparitions on the basis of these kinds of arguments, that perhaps their mind will be changed.